The next segment of our lesson, as we study conflict overall and the role of the knights in particular, will really zoom in on the impact of chivalry and what its purpose was. To introduce that topic, think about the questions on the screen. Pause the video as you ponder for a moment about these two sources. The first question's a bit easier. It's showing that you need to hone in on when this is being produced to recognize that this is a primary source since it's happening during the Middle Ages, that it's made during the events that it's describing. The Middle Ages are between 500 and 1500, and this is located in the 11th century, so it's part of these medieval events. The other painting is from the 1900s, which means it is a secondary source, made 4 centuries after the Middle Ages came to a close, and so no one alive in the production of this painting experienced the events firsthand. It's based upon memory or research, which makes it a secondary source. And that's a big hint towards this second question that was on the screen. I also put this title on the slide as a hint as well. Historiography is the study of the past, right? It's the study of history, and it looks at how our memory and understanding of events changes over time. During the Middle Ages, these depictions of the knights are clearly demonstrating their violence and brutality. It's focusing on the role of the knights as these military enforcers of the social order of the time. They are the part of the nobility that kept these lords and kings and barons and everybody else in power. And they did so through sheer strength, right? To the point where there's bodies littered in this tapestry. Fast forward 900 years, 400 years after the Middle Ages is over, and you'll notice that it's not the violence of the knight that's being celebrated in this painting and in many of the artworks from the time, but instead it's this more heroic, this chivalrous image of like a knight as this sort of shiny, cloaked, romantic figure saying goodbye to his lady in this castle like adorned with beautiful flowers. And it's demonstrating the way that our thinking about them has changed. And it reveals this really common pattern of history where in the moment we tend to focus a lot more on the harsh realities of what's happening. And in the aftermath, we tend to celebrate more the heroic, positive pieces that we choose to remember. This is true in our own individual lives, and it's true in history overall. As time passes, you start to distort what happened, and you focus on the positives, especially when you're looking at like the history of your own culture or place, where you don't want to draw attention to the negatives, but instead highlight the positives. And so in this case, one of these positives is chivalry. And if you've ever heard that term before, you may have learned that it is this set of rules and honor that shaped the behavior of the knights. But what we're going to see is that the reality was somewhat different. So take a moment and read this entry from World Book that kind of talks about that difference from reality. Pause the video now to read. And so what you can notice is like the first paragraph looks at the ideal. This is what they said chivalry would be. This is what we remember. This is how they wanted it to be considered. That it was a lot about faith and Christianity and generosity and honor. But the reality was different, and that they often only followed those rules when they were engaged with other people of their own social class. And these bottom couple of sentences are especially important because they are emphasizing how in history, and it's a really common pattern, people often justify their behavior by psychologically kind of excusing mistreatment of others by claiming that those others are different and often worse. And in this case, they're pointing out like the medieval people felt like your social and economic status was connected to your moral superiority, which means that like you were a better Christian, that you did a better understanding of right and wrong behavior, that you acted in a more positive way, and that's what brought your economic status. When in reality, so much of it was simply determined by birth. But what they were able to do then is claim that the reason the peasants were poor wasn't because they were exploited by the nobles or because they were born into impossible hardship, but it was because they were morally worse than the nobles, that they acted badly and deserved their status, and therefore, since they were bad people, it was okay to treat them worse. And we see that this kind of same pattern of thinking emerges in the early United States to excuse some of the treatment of slaves as well. And so it's this really kind of dark part of our own psychology and human nature. But what we're going to spend more of our time on in class is thinking about like what these actual rules were and sort of what the more practical purpose was behind them. And so if you have handout number 8, you can jot these down on your paper. If you don't, you can just like think about it in your head based upon what you can see on screen. But what I pulled was this selection from a book that presents these examples of common rules that were a part of chivalry. And then your job is to essentially translate these into like 21st century language instead of this like fake older language. Pause the video, think for a few moments on how you would explain these in more ordinary words. What I'd like you to do next is think about how you would match my short phrases to each of these statements. And so this is a chance for you to, if you were struggling, kind of have a word bank to pick from. Pause the video and attempt to do that now. All right. Here's how I would have matched these up. And so I think what we need to remember is just that there's rules, having them take a lot of pride and focus on things, but also to show obedience to certain groups. And I think that's where we kind of end when we think about chivalry, is what is the purpose? And what we need to understand is how big a part of the life of a knight this would have been. That these rules were set into the stories and poems and songs of the time. And in a period where there are no like TV shows and movies or access to a lot of books, you know, like that is how they got access to stories. That was their entertainment, was through these songs and poetry that people performed. And so from a very young age, that's what all of these like stories are teaching you about. When the knights were young, they were made to be pages and squires for other knights, and that's how they trained and learned. And from that incredibly young age, these master knights are hammering them with the importance of chivalry, and they can't be promoted unless they show that they understand it and they are acting that way. When they went to church, they heard sermons about the importance of chivalry. And all of this served to really culturally create this mindset from a young age that these knights had to follow these rules. And ultimately, it was a system of control. Because in a time period where there are no laws, or at least not well-established ones, where there's not governments or armies or courts or police forces like we're used to, you know, military strength was one of the main levers of power, and the knights had it. And the high-ranking nobles didn't want to have to constantly fear that these lower-ranking knights would rebel and turn against them and use their physical strength to gain more power for themselves. And so how can the nobles do that? Well, they use this cultural system to teach them the rules and make them follow it for their whole lives. And it didn't always work perfectly, but it did prevent a lot of attacks. And so what you might notice as you look through this list is that many of these rules very clearly benefit specific groups. Several of them line up with the lords, that they are teaching these young knights that they must be obedient, they must fight bravely, they must have pride in their government, which was basically like their local lord. They benefit the church. And then they do have some mention for the peasants, but those rules were far less often enforced. And so you can kind of see the prevalence of how many of these rules are strictly tied to those two groups that used chivalry as a method of control.